We are not born afraid of death. Children are not afraid of death. In fact, children are quite interested in death, quite curious about it. If you've ever walked down a road with a child and there's a dead bird along the side of the road, that child's going to go toward that dead bird. And they're going to ask questions about that dead bird, and they're going to ask questions about death. Because death is a complicated topic that they're trying to wrap their brain around, just like they're trying to wrap their brain around all kinds of other complicated topics. And the way those conversations happen in those moments let children know whether death is talkable or not. And as they age, they learn cognitively, they develop cognitively. Their anxiety about death may raise with that cognition, but what mostly happens is they take on what I call the societal yuck we have about death and dying conversations. Now, death anxiety is actually quite normal, quite logical, quite reasonable. Death is anxiety-provoking. So it's anxiety-provoking because it is the ultimate out-of-control situation. We have medical advances. We have decreased the mortality rate in amazing ways, but we will never control death. We have in the US a 1 in 6 chance of dying of heart disease, a 1 in 7 chance of dying of cancer, a 1 in 1 chance of dying. Dying is the great equalizer. Death is the great equalizer. And even on a college campus, we might think, oh, death, But, again, within the US, 1 in 1,000 18 to 25-year-olds die each year. So on a campus the size of Purdue, that's over 40 students a year. And if we talk about grief and bereavement, we know from the research my students and I have done on this campus, but research done across the country and in cases around the world, that 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 college students experiences a death loss within any 1 year period. That might be shocking to you, but it's quite consistent in the research. So death is anxiety-provoking because it's out of control. It's anxiety-provoking because there are many unknowns. We don't know exactly, in a general sense, when and how we will die. That's uncomfortable for us as human beings. We like to know things, we like to control things, and those issues are not so much there when we're talking about death. Also, it's anxiety-provoking because death involves a lot of loss. If we talk about the death of a person, we lose everything that person means to us. We lose all of the roles they play in our lives, all the plans we had with them. We lose all those things. If we think about our own death, we lose everything. We lose all relationships. We lose all the things we plan, all the things that we have. So it is very anxiety-provoking to think about death. So what am I saying? We should eliminate death anxiety? That should be our plan. That should be our goal. I'm not, actually. I believe that what we need is a moderate level of death anxiety. And the Eastern philosophies, the Eastern cultures, way ahead of the West in this way. If we think about the existentialists in my own field of psychology, Irvin Yalom talks about the givens of life, the greatest of which really is death, that we must cope with. We need a moderate level of death anxiety to energize us, to motivate us. Often, though, we have too much or we have too little. So we have too much death anxiety, and it can paralyze us. It can keep us from being engaged in the world in a very real and meaningful way. We can have too little death anxiety, where we can take life for granted, where we can focus too much on hassles and annoyances in life, okay? So I'm talking about being in the grocery store and someone has got 12 items in the 10-item line. Or you're driving, you're at the stop sign, and you know that it was your turn, and that person went before you, okay? In those situations, I think, we need a little more death anxiety. When I see someone in those situations and their tension raises, I think they need a little more death in their life. So my field is called Thanatology. And I'll just give a quick shout out to the Avengers, much less explaining to do lately in terms of what my field is about. It is the study of death and dying. And yet one of the founders of my field, Robert Kastenbaum, defined what we do, what we study, as the study of life with death left in. The study of life with death left in. And so much of what we do is we avoid death. We avoid conversations about death. The extent of this avoidance is very, very clear in our language. We will not use the words death, dying, and dead. We won't. We'll use euphemisms. In English, there's so many euphemisms for death. I mean, I could have slides of euphemisms of death in the English language. And there are actually many languages that have euphemisms for death. And it's an indication of, I really think, the avoidance of the topic and the avoidance of our sense of death anxiety. But we use the words death, dying, and dead for euphemisms for all other kinds of things. We'll talk about dead batteries, we'll talk about dying of laughter, but we won't use the words when we're actually talking about death, which is fascinating. My primary organization is called the Association for Death Education and Counseling. And when I share that with people, they say, "Oh, Heather, I didn't know you knew sign language." And I say, I, in fact, do not know sign language. The word that I said was death, not deaf. We won't use the words. We won't even hear the words. And we need to. We need to move toward rather than move away from our death anxiety. We need to face it, own it, and use it. We need to use it to hone our focus in our lives, to really consider and think deeply about what matters to us, to consider how precious every day is, every step that we take, because we cannot know. We cannot know when we will die. We need to use our death anxiety as a kind of flame inside of us, knowing that if we get too close to it, it's going to burn us. But if we're too far away, we get no benefit from the flame. But if we are close enough, we benefit from the light and the warmth that death anxiety can give to us and to our lives. But now, so far, all that I've shared is a very individualistic focus, which is, again, very much a part of often the U.S. culture, is what is in it for us, right? But if we think about death anxiety and our avoidance of death, it also has implications at a societal level, at an interpersonal level. And what are those implications? If we avoid death, then we will avoid those who are grieving and those who are dying. We will be apprehensive, we will be anxious about moving toward them, about continuing our connection with them. We will think, oh, I don't know what to say. Like, what if I say the wrong thing? Or what if I make it worse? Or what if they don't want to talk about what I bring up? Those things are really excuses. I mean, when someone is grieving, when someone is dying, they will be changed by those experiences. But at their core, they are still who we know them to be. And so we need to engage with them. And when we don't, what happens is that they experience social death. And it is only through our acknowledgement and our recognition of them that we can restore their social life. But we need a little scaffolding, okay? This is anxiety. These topics are anxiety-producing. And so I want to talk and share. So often I say, I wish that everyone knew just even 3 things about grief. And so I want to share those 3 things with you. The first of which is that grief does not end. Grief is a reflection of love and attachment, and just because a person dies doesn't mean we stop loving them. And so we will not stop grieving. And this may sound discouraging, but it's actually, again, an acknowledgement of that connection that existed. And so grief is not a sickness that people recover from. There's no recovery or closure in grief. And when we think about grief, we think about how it actually is an unfolding. It is not a life event, it's a life-changing experience. And we must integrate that life experience into our ongoing life narrative. One of my favorite quotes about grief is from a key philosopher of our time, Keanu Reeves, who said that grief changes shape, but it never ends. And I just love that quote because it captures sort of this three-dimensional physical sort of changing of grief over time. Grievers will talk about when they first experience the death, how their grief owns them. But over time, over reflection, there comes a point where they own their grief. So one of my colleagues, Bob Niebuhr, talks about how grief is actually the process of reconstructing our world. My colleague Tom Attic talks about grief is really about relearning who we are and relearning the world now that this person is no longer physically present. So grief does not end. Grief is multidimensional. Often, when we talk about grief or we think about grief, we think grief is crying and sadness. That's what grief is. It is actually not at all that. Grief is not even limited to emotions, let alone to crying. It is emotional, it is cognitive, it is social, it is behavioral, it is spiritual. It is all of those domains. It hits all of those domains, which is why it is so overwhelming to us as humans. It's why it's so overwhelming. So my students and I ran a support program for grieving families for 8 years, and we had a father in the program who had a rock that meant something to him. It represented his son who had died, and every day he kept that rock in his pocket. And every day at the evening time, he would take it out of his pocket, put it on his nightstand, and then in the morning he would take it and put it back in his pocket. Was he crying? No. Was he talking? No. Was he grieving? Absolutely, he was grieving. That narrow focus we have of grief is problematic. The judgment that people put on themselves when they're not grieving in the way that others say they should can become as much, if not more problematic than the grief itself. Okay? Grief is unique to each person. Okay? It does not end, it's multidimensional, and it is unique to each person. It is unique to each person in their familial, in their community, in their cultural contexts. It is unique based on who they are as people and how they move and live in the world. It will look the way they look as a person. It is also unique because of the unique relationship they had with the person who died. Often in families, we think the same person died, so we should all be grieving the same. We won't be. We will grieve based on who we are as people and the unique and individual relationship we had with that person who died. A concept called differential grief, which was coined by my colleague Kathleen Gilbert, who recently retired from IU, but we'll take her good work. So grief does not end. It is multidimensional and it is unique to each person. In terms of death and dying, in terms of the dying process, we actually know more research-wise in terms of the conversations between healthcare professionals and those who are dying and their family members than we actually know about the conversations that happen among family members, among friends, with those who are dying. Thanks to another colleague, Maureen Keeley, who is a communication researcher, who has done amazing qualitative and narrative-based research about end-of-life conversations. We know more about the themes of those conversations. And I'll share 4 with you. The first one is love. There are conversations about love in the dying process. There are conversations about identity, who you are, who I am, how we have been in relation to one another, what I value, what I respect, what I will miss about you. There are conversations about spirituality and religion. There are conversations about everyday routines, trying to maintain and connect to that sense of mortality in the dying process, that sense of normality in the dying process, trying to hold on to the living that is still happening in the dying process. So how can we be supportive? Right? I hope that you get a sense that it's really not about the words. There are no words that you can say that can fix grief. There are no words that you can say, no words of wisdom that will lighten the unbelievable load in the dying process. It is about our presence at those times. It is about our openness and willingness to push through our own anxiety, to send that note, to make that phone call, to get together, to be with that person. We need to remember who those individuals are as people and use that information. Right? Do you need to be do a joint activity, a shared activity that you've always done together? Do you need to do tangible support, like go and wash the dishes or shovel the snow? Do you need to open up the space for conversation? As one college student grieving shared in a study that we did, she had a good friend that came to her house and said to her, "Tell me everything. Don't hold anything back. I want to hear it all." What we need to do is think about restoring and maintaining their social life. We are not going to eliminate death anxiety, nor should we try. We need to face it, we need to own it, and we need to use it. When death can become approachable, when it can become talkable, we don't have to spend our precious energy trying to deny it or avoid it or control it. We will value our own lives and the lives of others more. And we will live more fulfilling lives. More fulfilling lives because we are living lives with death left in. Thank you.